All right, good evening, friends. I'll give another minute or two for people to arrive. See if we get any more people showing up, but I'm very glad to see all of you. We'll be learning today in the Constitutes Shulchan Aruch, continuing to explore the brachot that we make before eating. Last week we looked at the basic brachot that we make and what foods are covered by which. This is going to continue on that theme. And we'll be exploring the basic rules about when do you make this bracha, when do you make that bracha. But the general approach to making bracha we covered last week, and we'll be, for those of you who want to look it up, this is going to be covering Kitzur Shulchan Aruch chapter 52. I believe we did chapter 50 last time, and we skipped 51 because that deals with the brachot after eating, and we'll get to that in coming weeks. Again, we'll just give another minute or two, see if anybody else comes. Okay, you should be able to see now the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, chapter 52. Arrange this over here so you can see that. All right. So last week we talked about the different brachot, some of them, and how they are sort of like nesting circles, right? Shehakol covers everything, and Borei Pri Adama covers everything that grows from the ground, which includes trees which grow from the ground, and Borei Pri Eitz only covers things that grow from trees. And so therefore we learned last week that you should be careful to make them in the right order so that you can be sure to make as many brachot as possible. That first you should start with something that grows from the tree, and then the thing that grows from the ground, and then afterwards things which are not either going from the tree or going from the ground, so that you can make all three of those brachot. You can also make a mizonot if you're eating grains, right? Foods that are made from grain. I believe last week's shiur is recorded and it can be found online somewhere. Okay, so this week we're going to start looking at when we have different foods and different manners of preparation, how does that affect their bracha? Right? That we're going to say the same bracha on cooked fruit or a raw fruit, or if it's ground up, etc. So we're going to start to look at a little more detail into going into what bracha to make on which food. Now, this is something that there are, like I said, there can be some debates on these things which go on for generations and generations, which are not clear, and you'll see different people making the different brachot on the same food. This happens particularly with rice and millet, because the Gemara is ambiguous there. It sort of treats it as we don't quite know how to treat them. And so people in different generations have come up with different conclusions regarding rice and millet, do we treat them as a grain? Do we treat them as a fruit? Do we, all of these questions? Okay. So over fruits that grow on a tree, you say the bracha borei pri eitz, who create. It shouldn't be created. It's actually creates. It's in the present tense. It's not in the past. Creates the fruit of the tree. Over fruit or vegetables that grow in the ground or on the ground, which include various condiments, vegetables, legumes, corn, and herbs. You say the bracha borei pri ha'adama, who creates the fruit of the ground. And so, how do we distinguish between the two? What is a tree and what is on the ground or in the ground? Right. So we have things like grow all kinds of bushes or other sort of they're not quite a tree. You know a tree when you see one, and they're not quite not a tree. So what do we call them? So what is going to be the determining factor? And appropriate, of course, that we're studying now about trees. This is Rosh Chodesh Shvat, the beginning of the month of Shvat, in which we are going to celebrate Tu B'Shvat, which is sort of the new year of the tree. And according to Beit Shammai, it's not on Tu B'Shvat at the full moon; it's here at the new moon. So today, according to Beit Shammai, is the renewal, the new year of the tree. So appropriate, perhaps, that we're studying about trees. Okay, so in order to be called a tree, it must have branches that survive the winter to produce leaves again. Right? The sense is that it's there from year to year, and it's not just all the branches don't fall off. The branches need to survive the winter. That's a very important thing, because you have some things where the roots are there and the main sort of stem, and it'll have to grow its branches and leaves all over again, and that's not going to be considered a tree. But a tree, has branches that the leaves may fall off, but the branches remain. Okay, so to survive the winter, produce leaves again, even though they are as thin as the stalks of flax, right? They could be very thin branches, but they need to be there throughout the winter, that they don't fall off. However, a plant whose branches perish in the winter, although its roots remain intact, is not called a tree, and over its fruit we say a bari pri adama. So this is the benchmark for what constitutes a tree. And so there are fruits like a banana, even though we sort of colloquially will refer to banana trees, stalks, they don't have branches that survive the winter. Their branches are all sort of fall off, and they can grow again from the same root. You don't have to replant them every year, but it'll be a new growth. It won't be the same as from the previous year. And so for that reason, we don't make a bari priya eitz on a banana. We make a bari priya adama. Okay, so that's always the thing. So the things like blueberry bushes, they do remain. So you say a bari priya eitz on a blueberry, right? But certain things like things that grow on vines, other than grapes, things like pumpkins, gourds of various varieties. They don't survive the winter. They'll grow again in the spring, and so they're of course going to be a bari priya adama. And everything that we're going to have to look at, is it a tree or is it not a tree? This is going to be the benchmark. Okay, so before taking part of food which is not grown in the earth, right, such as meat, fish, and cheese, and similarly for drinking any beverage other than wine and olive oil, you say the bracha shakol niyabid varo. These are things which are not, we can't say bari priya adama, right? Cows don't grow from the ground, and nor do fish, and so anything which is going to be meat or dairy, or eggs, or any animal product, anything that doesn't grow out of the ground, and similarly any food, right? That here is saying any beverage which is not wine, which you say bari priya gafen, and olive oil, since their understanding was that most olives are grown for oil, that's their primary purpose, and that olive oil you'd actually say bari priya eitz, because that's sort of the intent when you have olives growing on the trees, that you'll make oil. So that's an interesting thing there. Now most of us are not accustomed to drinking olive oil straight, but that if you were to, you could say bari priya eitz on the olive oil. So here you say the bracha shehakol nihya bidvaro, nihya, right? So they have to here the way they write it nihya, they don't sort of swallow that first hay. You can see nihya. There's a breathy there, so it's nihya bidvaro, through whose word everything came to be, or there something to that in whose word all exists, something along those lines. All right, nihya means that it exists, but it's a passive form of existence. It doesn't exist of its own accord. It is brought into existence by his word. V'teva nihiyah yesh l'mar yu b'kamas. You should write it nihiyah and not nihiyeh. There's some halachic authorities that suggest that we should not pronounce it nihiyah, which would mean in the past, but like we make borei pri ha'etz, who creates, so it should be nihiyeh, which would be in the present tense. But in general, we say no, that's not how we make this particular bracha. That this one should be nihiyah in the past. Everything came into being, right? That everything exists by your word. That it was brought into being already, not that it is being brought in, not happening right now. There are people, especially in the city of Hebron in Israel, the Rosh Yeshiva there is one of these people that says no, it should be nihiyeh. And so people who you can spot them, if they learned in Hebron when they say nihiyeh. But in general, we say that everything came into being by His word. Even though mushrooms and truffles grow in the moisture of the earth, they do not receive nourishment from the earth. The rabbinic understanding of fungi is that they're not plants, and that is correct according to modern science, and that they don't draw their sustenance from the earth in the same way that plants do, and rather their understanding was that they receive nourishment from the earth, but through not from the earth, but through the atmosphere. They pull it in through above the ground, through the air, and therefore you should not make a bari pri adama on mushrooms or truffles, even though they seem to grow on the ground, right? So, but they're not the fruit of the ground. Therefore, you should say shehakol over mushrooms. This is again something not everybody knows. You say, oh, this is no difference between a carrot and a mushroom. Well, there is, and so mushrooms. I don't. There are all kinds of mushrooms, right? That we now have. You can go to the specialty, grocery store, and you can find 7, 8, 12, 15 different kinds of mushrooms, each more exotic than the next. On all of them, you're going to make a shehakol. Yes, Keshav.
Sorry, Rabbi, I was a bit late. I want to clarify something. So, shehakol only applies to stuff that's outside the ground. So,
so far, he's going to tell us that there's many other things that you're going to make shehakol on.
Yeah, because you previously mentioned shehakol could apply to everything in a meal, including the salad, right?
That's right. So again, shehakol is the all-inclusive bracha. That if you made shehakol even over bread and wine, which we have very specific brachot for, so you're allowed. You've made your bracha. That's sufficient. However, we don't want to rely on them, right? That's sort of a low-level praise, and we want to be more specific with God, praising Hashem, for the particulars of His creation in as much detail as we can.
So I understood that part. Okay, so shehakol applies to that by extension. Two things which arise immediately over here. When you discussed the English translation with me of shehakol, you said it was important. Two things I recall specifically. You said it is preferable if you are able to phrase it in the passive voice, so as to say, by His will everything exists, or something to that order. But also it exists in the present tense. So how do you?
No, that's what we're talking about. Shehakol nihiyeh or shehakol nihiyah.
Yes, but so because in English you mentioned, so in Hebrew you mentioned nihiyah, but in English you mentioned exists. So how do you reconcile those two personally?
No, I think there might be some confusion. I think that there, in general, we want to we like to speak to God in the present tense, and we believe in the sort of constant creation. Halachically, when we're going to say it, shekol nihiyah bidvaro is the generally accepted pronunciation of it, and therefore it's in the past tense. I may have shared with you that I sort of like the idea better of saying it in the present tense, but I think that the halachic sort of consensus is to say it in the past.
Also, how do you square the second part over here about shehakol applying to mushrooms, because mushrooms, because mushrooms aren't even autotrophs, so there's no way to say they get this stuff from the air, right? So when something is so obviously, pardon my French, out of whack, how do you reconcile it with brachot which are meant to be sincere? Like, how do you, like, don't you have a
Oh,
model?
well, look, but the way that Shehakol functions, right, is that it catches everything. That we believe that everything was brought into existence by God's word, right? God spoke the world into existence. Let there be light, let there be a firmament, etc. So it's not incorrect to say that mushrooms were brought in by God's word. Now, the question of which word were they brought in, right, into existence by, is an interesting question, because we don't see anywhere in the order of creation that God says, "Let there be fungi." Right, and so where exactly are they coming from? We don't have clear, as opposed to vegetation and trees, which are quite clear, right? That on the third day of creation, God said, "Let the earth support wild vegetation," and trees that make fruit trees that make fruit. You know, so we have a clear sense of there's a difference and different words being used, but because we don't have a sort of a clear sense of which words. With which words God created mushrooms, they sort of fall into the everything else, all the leftovers, that we don't have a particular thing that we can attach them to. Right? They don't grow from the ground. They don't grow from the tree. And so where do we put them? They're created.
Aren't fungi considered plants, though?
They're not considered plants. No, and for that reason, they're the laws of in the agricultural laws in the land of Israel of taking tithes and whatnot on plants, they don't apply to mushrooms.
So I'm assuming the fact that they have cell walls and plastids is not exactly an argument.
I don't think that's the categories that we're
okay.
Yeah. You know, the modern scientific understanding is not necessarily the basis that halacha is going to draw on, right? And so this statement that they receive their nourishment not from the earth but from the atmosphere. Now, I'm not a what are they, mycologist? Is that what they're called? The scientists who study fungi. I don't know enough about how they get their thing to know if it's correct or incorrect. This is what the rabbis understood, but the rule is nevertheless the same. That we're gonna, even if their understanding and the sort of the reasoning behind their rule can sort of be disproved, the fact that they made the rule that these should be blessed shakol niyav, so we follow the rule even if we don't tend to agree with their understanding of science. Right? That their purpose in making rules was not to teach us science, but to teach us gratitude, etc., and place us in relationship with Hashem. So if we understand differently, so that's okay. It doesn't change the rule. So for that reason, they mushrooms and truffles and other sort of fungi that thing, and incidentally, seaweed. Seaweed also is going to come in the shahakol category, right? So seaweed, perhaps you would think that it should be we make a new bracha, Bari Pri Hayam, right? Who creates the fruit of the sea, or that we would have them included with Borei Pri Adama, but they don't really grow from the ground, and so they're understood to be also shahakol. So that's an interesting. Anything we don't sort of know that it can go into any of these other brachot, so shahakol is going to be the catch-all.
So just to clarify, what is the definition for grow from the ground over here?
Yeah, it hasn't clearly defined it. But I think it's going to be vegetation that grows in the ground, and as opposed to vegetation that grows in the sea. Now you can start to question, well, what about seaweed that has, maybe it does grow in the ground in the sea, right? And we can have a whole conversation on that subject.
Like I would assume you'd say Ha'adama say for lotus, right? And lotus has a root and a stem, even though it's in the water, and right. Because say you eat a lotus petals can be used for all sorts of different things. So you'd say a hardama on them. What would happen in that case then?
I think you would, if they grow and they have roots in the ground. I think again we have to discern, are they growing in water, but they have roots in the ground, or are they sort of sea plants? But if they're growing in the ground, we would still say Bari Pri Adama on them. For example, lilies. Right, which are flowers which grow in the roots, right? They have their roots in the thing, but they grow on a pond or something. They'll still say Bori Pri Adama if you eat from them.
I'm very sorry for taking up your time. I just want to clarify this because this is actually confusing.
No,
So
it is. It's very. Look, it's a thing that the rabbis didn't have so much exposure to, right? That they were not botanists and they had seen these things, so they had not seen everything. But I think that it's clear when it grows, when its nourishment comes from the ground, we're going to call it a Bori Pri Adama. And when it's sort of absorbing its nourishment from the sea, from the water, and not from the ground, we'll probably make a shahakal.
And mushrooms basically are saprophytic and therefore they're not absorbing the nutrition from the ground. Is that the argument?
I don't know the word you use, but the understanding was that they absorb their nutrition from the air and not from the ground.
I'm trying to understand how you decide something draws a nutrition from the air and not say like, I don't know, that.
I think you have to put the puzzle together backwards. The rule is given that they are shakol, right? That they're not plants. That's understood. Okay, that they're not plants, and we don't say so. Then we don't say Bori Pri Adam on them, and then sort of we got to figure out why that might be. So a theory we could theorize, right? As I said, well, because they don't draw their, yeah. But the sense is that we have first we have the rule, and then we have to figure out why, and that's the way halacha often works. Is that we have a rule for something that's passed down, that this is the tradition, and later we have to reverse engineer it to figure out how do they come to that conclusion. But the rule is nevertheless going to be the same. Now, it's important that we can have different people will theorize different theories of how they came to that conclusion, because then when we encounter something new, which we don't have a tradition over, right, that could be the lotus or the seaweed or whatever else. So the understanding by which we apply the reasoning can influence how we're going to make decisions. But in general, halacha doesn't give us first a reasoning and then the rule, but first gives us the rule, and then there's
just
surmising what the reasoning was.
So I remember this discussion with you, and you mentioned the whole bifurcation. Ashkenazi halakha is descriptive. Sephardi tends to be prescriptive, and basically, for example, turkeys became kosher because there was no tradition of eating turkeys to the Ashkenazim, but the Sephardi decided that it is prescriptively permissible to eat turkeys. There became a tradition, and therefore Ashkenazim could do so. That's correct? So my question over here is, if mushrooms weren't plants, how did we determine that mushrooms are kosher in the first place, if not for something like that?
I suspect that there were mushrooms back in the day when we had prophets. And that this is something very, very ancient, and that which bracha to make on them was determined, a very long time ago, before they started the process of writing down Torah Shebaal Peh, right? Well before the Mishnah, and so that this was something that people were doing in ancient Israel, a very, very long time ago. And it developed that way. I don't see any reason to suspect that our ancestors weren't making brachot, right? That making a bracha is something which is a very ancient, also a very ancient origin. And the fact that they can't figure out exactly why we do it in the Gemara, and they come to different reasonings, attest to the fact that this is something that we do, and we have to figure out why. But this is something that we've been doing forever. And we have to, so then we have to sort of understand afterwards. So I suspect that the same thing here is with mushrooms and truffles, that they had them, people were making shahakal on them, and they had to figure out why.
And they were kosher throughout history.
Yeah, sure. There's also a thing, what do you have with certain foods, that are going to be kosher until proven prohibited, right? And not the other way around. Although that's part of the question with birds, right? With the Ashkenazim, that they were saying, no, with animals, we're going to say this is prohibited until proven kosher. But with anything else, we're going to see if there's nothing in the Torah, nothing in our tradition says you can't eat this, right? We see, for example, that all vegetation was given to Adam to eat, right? So now mushrooms are not vegetables, they're not vegetation. Nevertheless, this was something understood that we are allowed to eat. People were eating, and before we had to figure out the law, this was already sort of in practice.
So sorry to take up even more of your time, but there is another question which pops up, which is mushrooms, are growing on dead and decaying creatures, essentially. Yes,
I missed the middle word there. What creatures?
They kind of grow on dead and decaying organic matter, correct? More or less.
Again, I'm not a mycologist. I don't know, but I would assume that they don't grow on things which are completely inorganic, right? You don't see mushrooms growing on stones.
Yep. No, I understand that part. So my thing is, mushrooms basically decomposing and eating organisms does not make them cannibalistic and therefore preclude them from consumption. So there is a bit of a difference, however, when we say cows, right? Because it's meant to have split hooves and chew their cud. But we know from things such as the mad cow disease that cows can be fed meat and they will eat it. Is there anything about food becoming not kosher because it is eating meat, like say a mushroom is or a cow is eating meat? In either of those two cases, if it is known that the animal or the organism has been feasting on meat to survive, does it become not kosher?
Yeah, I don't think so. We have the case in the Gemara of when somebody plants an apple tree on a pig corpse. The apples are perfectly kosher. So again, the fact that if cows sort of naturally ate other cows, other than in Pharaoh's dream, right? They would perhaps not be considered kosher. But because in the general, cow population, eating of cows is not something they do, and only when we as humans have sort of forced it upon them, they do that. So we understand cows to be a kosher animal. And when there's a transition of organisms, right, that is no longer this organism, is that organism, and the later organism is kosher, we're going to continue to eat it. We see that also with fish, right? That when a kosher fish eats a shrimp, so that becomes right, and integrates it into his body, it becomes kosher. So the same thing would be with mushrooms growing on a pig corpse, right, or pig feces would still be kosher, right? Even though the pig corpse and the pig feces are not, because there's been a transfer of organism. It's something else now.
So just to wind this up, so it is not out of the question that kosher beef can carry mad cow disease, because a kosher meat producer could technically have like cow meat being fed to cows.
Yes, I think you're correct. That it does not render it. Now, it could be that if a cow has mad cow disease, right, that the disease itself could render the cow a treifa, right? That we're only allowed to eat ostensibly healthy animals.
Yep.
So that's a whole nother question. You have to get into veterinary science, and again, I'm not well enough informed on the particulars of if a cow with mad cow disease, how long it can live and etc.
No, prions take a very long time, and I don't believe they'll show up in the lungs. But thanks. Sorry, I've been grilling you, but I really appreciate the help.
Yeah, that's good questions. Okay, we continue on now. We say the bracha bari priya eitz and bari priya adama only over articles of food which are best eaten raw, right? And which, as a rule, are eaten raw, right? But if so, that means when we eat an apple or a pear, right, we eat them raw. That they're generally, and it's not only that they're eaten raw. You can have baked apples and applesauce, but in generally, people recognize an apple as a fruit which is properly eaten raw. Yeah. But for example, potato, you can, and if you're starving, raw potato will sustain you, I think. But it's rather unpleasant, and in general, you don't eat raw potatoes. And so therefore, if you have a raw potato, you're not going to make a bari priya adama on the raw potato, because potatoes are generally eaten cooked. Right? So therefore, if you eat a cooked potato, you make a bari priya adama on a cooked potato. Whereas if you eat a cooked apple, since apples are generally eaten raw, you would not make a bari priya eitz on the cooked apple. So you have to be a little bit complicated and important to sort of keep things straight here. So it says if it's best eaten raw, or as a rule is eaten raw. However, if it is not the custom to eat them raw, but only when cooked, even though they could also be eaten raw, nevertheless, since it is not the favored that is not the favored way that they are eaten. Their bracha is said only when they're eaten in a cooked state, right? So a cooked potato, you'll eat, you make a bari pri adama. Same thing, many vegetables. But if you do eat them raw, you should recite only shahakol, right? If you're eating a cooked raw potato and nobody in your area, let's say, no, it's not normal to eat raw potatoes. So and the people who grew them, again, today in our global economy, things are so different, right? Because we're eating foods that are grown halfway around or all the way, the complete opposite end of the world sometimes. But nevertheless, if they're eaten normally cooked, so you say bari pri adama when they're cooked. And if they're eaten normally raw, you say bari pri adama or bari pri eitz when they're eaten raw. But if you do eat them raw or you eat them cooked when they're normally eaten raw, you say shahakol, because that's sort of not the normal way to eat them. Pickled food is considered as cooked food. Pickling is a well respected form of preparing food, and therefore pickling is sort of considered a form of cooking. And so again, if this food is normally eaten pickled, and you eat it unpickled, so there's room for conversation there. Right, so consequently, before eating sauerkraut, you should say bari pri adama. Why? Because this is a totally normal way to eat cabbage. It's not the only way to eat cabbage. Cabbage is also one of these vegetables that can be eaten both raw and cooked. Right, carrots are another one, and so on and so forth. Many vegetables that we have, bell peppers, etc. That can be eaten both raw and cooked, and are eaten both raw and cooked, and therefore you could say bari pri adama. In both cases. Similarly, salted food is considered the same as cooked food if that's the normal way of preparing it. Okay, so now what about foods which are generally so pungent that we don't eat them on their own or we don't eat them raw? Before eating radishes, we're talking about the different kinds of radishes, but they're in the Gemara when they talked about radishes as being very, very pungent. So they had whatever kind of radishes they had, or maybe turnips or something that really carries a strong punch. Right? They can have these sort of spicy radishes. You should say bari pri adama. Likewise, over garlic and onions that are soft and can be eaten raw, although as a rule they're eaten with bread. Nevertheless, if you eat them without bread, you recite them with bari pri adama. Some people do eat raw onions, right? You have it on a sandwich or something. I've even seen one person that was strange, but to me, but I saw him peel an onion and eat it like an apple, right? So to take a bite out of an onion. And although this is not sort of normal, because onions are eaten raw, you could still say bari pri adama. Yes, Giovanna, is that? I see you raising a hand.
Yes, I have a question. Like, for example, when you eat like raw food, for example, you eat an apple, do you have to like wash it in a determinate way? Do you have to do something before eating the apple, for example?
Oh, very good. I mean, other than making the blessing to prepare it like washing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is a whole set of laws that we don't keep today, which are particular to the land of Israel when we have a Beit HaMikdash, and that deals with the categories of ritual purity and impurity, Tuma and Tahara. And these are categories of Halacha, which is a huge corpus of laws, which are completely non-applied today. So if we were keeping Tuma and Tahara, there would be a great deal of conversation of how do you wash it? When do you need to wash it? What does it matter if it's dry or has it ever been washed? There's a fantastic amount of material to talk about there, but none of that is applicable today. There's nothing in Halacha today that is dependent on keeping Tuma and Tahara. There are some suggestions that maybe there are things that could be relevant today, but for the most part, they're disregarded. And the question of challah, when we have a mitzvah of taking, when a person makes dough and takes challah, there's a mitzvah of taking some and separating it out for the kohanim, as would be done in the Beis HaMikdash. There's a whole conversation there of maybe a kohen who is young and never had tumah, So that's the whole conversation. But in general, we don't deal with any of that stuff. And so the question of washing and preparing it is not going to be relevant to us halachically today. Hopefully one day soon we'll be doing Tuma and Tara in a practical halacha class. But for the time being, we don't. And so the only sort of precondition for eating it is that you say a blessing. That's outside of the land of Israel. In the land of Israel, even today, there's a whole subset of laws dealing with the agricultural tithes. So this fruits that are grown in Israel need to be properly tithed, right? And that's applicable today. But when you buy food from the store in Israel, and it usually will indicate that it's kosher and that the proper tithes have already been taken, and you don't have to worry about that either. But if you have your own tree, for example, right? My mother for many years had a clementine tree in her yard, and we would have hundreds and hundreds of clementines every year, and we had to take the proper tithes ourselves, and then it's same with any other tree that you may have, right? Any fruit bearing tree. But today, outside of the land of Israel, none of that applies, and the only precondition for eating a fruit or thing, right? Anything which is natural produce is going to be kosher. All vegetables and all fruits are kosher, and only required to say bracha. But it's a wonderful question. Thank you. Okay, so we're saying that things which are could be eaten, right, in a sandwich, like raw garlic, raw radishes, raw onions. Normally you wouldn't eat them just by themselves, but if you do, because they are usually eaten as a garnish raw, so you say bari priya adama. But if the garlic and onions have grown old, which gives them a very strong flavor, so they're not usually eaten raw, then if you do eat them raw, you should say bracha shehakol. Again, you have to look not only at the what fruit it is, but also the state of it, right? And this can apply also to dried certain things when they're dried, right? We have ginger. Ginger, when fresh, people will use it and sometimes eat it raw. Dried ginger, less so, right? And many other things. So we have to be aware, in its current state, is this something which is normally eaten raw? If it is, so you can say bari priya damar, bari priya eitz on it. And if it's not, if it's only eaten cooked, so then if you're eating it raw, you should say shehakol. And the same thing goes the opposite. If it's something which is normally eaten raw and you're eating it cooked, although that's not the normal way to eat it, so you could also say a shehakol, right? I don't know that people normally cook cucumbers, right? That the cucumbers are not something that is generally, at least in the North American cuisine, not eaten cooked, and therefore, if you had cooked cucumber, right, cooked lettuce, things which are normally eaten raw, you would say a shehakol. Okay, there are some things, if you eat articles of food that taste better raw than cooked, right? That's what we just mentioned, right? Because cooking spoils them. And you should say over them when they are cooked, only the bracha shehakol, right? That's our cooked cucumber. Even if they're cooked with meat and their taste is improved because of the meat, nevertheless, since the meat is the main dish, we would say over only the bracha shehakol, right? They're coming along with the meat, so you make a shehakol on the meat, and that'll cover the cooked cucumber with it. However, if they were cooked in a way that made them into the main dish, if what I'm really serving here is cooked cucumber, and I've made it in a way that makes it fantastic and delicious, or if the cooking improved them, as for example, when they were fried in oil or on honey, right? I've done something with them that has made them better, and then you would say they're appropriate bracha because it makes no difference whether they were cooked in water or in oil and honey, as long as the food itself is improved by the cooking process, right? This is something that has made it into an improvement on it. So then we're going to give it its proper bracha. And only when it's less good than the normal way that it's eaten will we make a shehakol. Okay, so now we're dealing with kinds of fruit, they say inferior kinds of fruit. They grow on brambles or thorn bushes or on trees which grow wild and are not planted, right? So we have crab apples that are generally not they're not really good for eating. You have other kind of berries that are not they're wild and they're not inedible, they're just not very tasty, perhaps, or they're not a kind of thing which are usually grown as crops, right? That we don't grow them for eating. These are things that we're foraging and we're finding in the forest. And so many of these things are when you eat them raw, they're not fit to eat, right? They're really bitter, they're really sour. Then in such a case, you wouldn't make a bari pri adama or a bari pri eitz on them if they're not fit to eat raw. And then even if they're cooked or fried in honey and made edible, you should still recite a shahakol because they're not something which is normally eaten cooked either, right? So this is again foods which are not, you don't buy them in the supermarket. This is not something which is normally eaten. Now it might not be normally eaten because people don't know about it, right? And it might be things. So, but this is not speaking about apples that are growing wild. Right, that are good apples, and they're the same as the apples that we have. They're talking about apples that are not that nobody would buy. Nobody would buy them. They're too sour for taste. But if you're hungry, you can find a way to cook them and make them edible, or you could even eat them raw. But it wouldn't be. It's not the same as eating an apple, right? It's unpleasant, and it's not the kind of thing. So we would not say bari priya eitz on them. But hazelnuts, although they grow wild in the forest, are considered superior articles of food, and you should recite bari priya eitz over them. Things which are normally eaten, right? These are normal crops that are domesticated and people grow them. And these happen to be wild, right? When you see this all the time with wild raspberries in different places, right? Different climates. And you see this with in Israel with wild cacti, right? What they call sabras. These prickly cactus fruits that are growing wild all over. So those, because they are normally eaten fruits, these are things which are cultivated and people do eat them. So when you find them growing wild, you're still going to make the appropriate bracha. Bari priya eitz, bari priya adama, whatever it is. All right, herbs which grow wild without cultivation. Right, these are things which again we're out in the field, out in the forest. And we find things that are edible. If they're cooked and made into a special dish, nevertheless, since they were not cultivated by man, they're not considered the fruit of the ground, and you should say shahakol over them. Meaning that this is something, this is not something that has been curated, right? This is something which happens to be growing, and you're sort of not. They wouldn't normally be considered food, right? So we don't, when you say, how is it normally eaten? Normally it's not eaten, right? So then you're going to say hashakol, right? We always have to ask, how do we normally eat this? Do we normally eat this raw? Do we normally eat this cooked? Normally we don't eat this, so therefore it's not going to be. Yes, Giovanna.
Yes, sorry. I think I got another question that I think is going to be practical.
Please.
But I wanted to ask you about cooking food, right? Do you have to you cook something on a pan, right? As the pan has to be for example, you have to do something with the pan before cook food on it.
So that's a whole another conversation, right? Then we're dealing with it needs to be kosher. And what constitutes kosher pans and kosher cookware? The whole category of what is and isn't kosher is a whole nother section of learning that we will eventually get to and hopefully cover. But if it's a kosher pan, so then no, there's nothing to do with it specifically every time you cook. There is a requirement of if a Jew buys a pan from a non-Jew, right? And it's brand new; it's never been used, so the kosher is not a problem. And you still have to immerse it in the mikveh to sort of before you start using it. That's a separate mitzvah. It's not really about kosher, and it's not really about this. But there are things that need to be done usually just once. But in every time you cook, there's no ritual of preparing the pan for cooking, but it needs to be a pan that's kosher. and that has been taken to the mikveh if it was purchased from a non-Jew.
Sorry, I gotta how do you know that actually a pan is kosher, like other than the sign on the back of the etiquette? Like, how do you know that?
Yeah, that's a difficulty. You're going to know that a pan is kosher because it's in a home that has of people that keep kosher, right? That it's yours, and you ensure that it's only been used for the right things and not for the wrong things. There's no visual way to identify this pan is kosher and this one is not. But in general, if you come into a place where the assumption is that things are not kosher, unless the people who live there and keep it, keep Shabbat and keep kosher, so then you can sort of trust that it is kosher. But if you're going, for example, to an Airbnb, in Israel it may be different. There may be information on kosher stuff. But we traveled across country. We stayed in an Airbnb in Kansas. There we said no. We have to treat all of those pans as unkosher, and we have to accordingly prepare food with them as if they're unkosher, or we need to make them kosher. But there's no way to visually tell that a pan is kosher or not kosher. You can't. It doesn't leave a mark. But if once it's been used for non-kosher food, so the sense is the flavor of the non-kosher food is absorbed in the pan, and if you cook something else in the pan, it's now, even if it's a kosher food that you cook in the non-kosher pan, is now going to be non-kosher. That's a whole nother category of study that we'll eventually get to. I don't mean to set you aside, but it's a little bit of a bigger question than something to cover while we're learning brachot. Okay, so he said herbs would grow wild without cultivation are fit to eat raw, right? So if you could eat them raw, so eat them raw. But if they're cooked and made into a special dish, nevertheless, since they were not cultivated by man, they're not considered a fruit of the ground. You should say shahakol over them, right? If you were to eat them raw, you would still say bari pri adama because they can be eaten raw and they did grow on the ground. But if you come in and take them, and make something out of them that's not the way that they're normally used, so that's going to be shahakol. Lettuce and similar vegetables that are planted require the bracha bari pri adama, right? This is things which people grow, and it doesn't matter if they're the leaf of the plant, or the stem of the plant, or the root of the plant, or the fruit of the plant. If it's a plant that's not a tree, it's going to be bari pri adama. Furthermore, regarding herbs that grow wild, if they produce superior fruit, such as blackberries and raspberries, the bracha said on them is bari pri adama. Right? So here we're not talking about eating the blackberries and raspberries, because I think blackberries and raspberries are generally considered bari pri eitz. But here we're talking about if you're eating the blackberry leaves, and the stems of their plant, because they're not the fruit, and so therefore they you'd say bari pri adama. And the same thing goes with other trees. If you're eating the bark or the wood of a tree that produces fruit, right? So the fruit you might say bari pri eitz, but on the tree itself you would say bari pri adama. Okay, that which is not the main part of the fruit is not considered as the fruit itself, but on a lower level. There are some things that we eat nevertheless, right? Like there are people who'll eat orange peel, right? And use it as a garnish or use it as a flavor, the peel. Now, I think obviously when we have an orange, if we're going to eat the orange, we're going to say bari pri ha'etz on the orange, because the oranges grow on a tree. But we wouldn't consider the orange peel to be the fruit of the tree, right? So therefore, that's more like the tree than it is the fruit. And so if it's the fruit of a tree, you say the secondary part of the bracha, bari pri adama. So if you're eating orange peels, not as along with the fruit, but you're eating them individually, so you say bari pri adama on the orange peel. Kesha, do you have another question?
Yeah, actually two. So one, if the previous paragraph said if you cook it, you would say shehakol. And if you have it raw, you'd still say shehakol. Herbs which are grown.
No, if you had it raw, right? You say herbs which grow wild without cultivation are fit to eat raw, right? They're saying that, again, herbs is perhaps misleading here. Because when I think herbs, I'm thinking about, oregano, time, right? I'm thinking things which are not of substantive. They're just a very small thing that I would use to season. But here it means grasses or leaves. So we're talking about any sort of leafy foliage that you're going to eat, that they grow wild that you can eat. So you go ahead and eat them. If you can make a bar priya adama on them if they're since they grow from the ground and they're fit for eating, but they're not normally cooked. They're not taken and cooked, and so they're not normally eaten cooked because people don't normally eat them at all. Because right.
Okay, that I guess that makes some sense. But the part which actually got me, if you go to the next paragraph where we were right now, so it says secondary part, right? So now what do you do in the case of say grape leaves? Now grapes are the primary thing.
Oh, very good.
But grape leaves are like a Turkish delight.
That's right. That's right. So when you have dolmates, right, that are stuffed grape leaves, or if you're eating the grape leaf by itself, often it's not uncommon to have pickled grape leaves or something. The dolmas you might have a whole different thing because they're maybe the grape leaf is secondary to the rice, perhaps. There's a whole nother conversation. But if you're eating grape leaves, you would say Barei Pri Ha'adama. Even though they grow on a tree, since these are the leaves, these are not the primary fruit of this plant, and therefore you say Barei Pri Ha'adama on the grape leaf, just as you would on the orange peel.
Even though the grape leaf is, itself considered something worth eating.
Yeah, it is a secondary fruit, but it's not the primary fruit. It might be somewhere that they grow special grapevines just for the leaves. And perhaps if that were the case, maybe on that particular kind, but I don't think that that's the case with most grape leaves. Most, grape leaves they're a secondary product where the primary product of the vine is the grapes, and that they are a secondary product that you would say Barei Pri Ha'adama on. Giovanna, yes.
Yes, sorry, I got a question. What about the seeds of the fruit?
The seeds of the fruit. Okay, again, now we have to ask: are we eating the seed of the fruit specifically? Meaning, is this a seed that we grew this fruit to eat the seed, right? And that's the case with things like nuts, right? When we grow walnuts, there is a fleshy part on the outside of the walnut that nobody eats. It's very, very bitter. And we're growing the walnut fruit to eat the seed. And since that's what we grew it for, that's considered the primary fruit. But if it's something like orange seeds, that are not normally eaten on their own, they're secondary. But if you were eating just an accumulation of orange seeds, I've never heard of somebody doing so. So you would say Barei Pri Ha'adama. But if you're eating the seeds along with the orange, right? So then it's not a problem to eat the seeds and to swallow them. You wouldn't because they're secondary to the fruit of the orange. But with a nut or another thing where it's the primary thing you're going for is the seed of the fruit. So then you would say Barei Pri Ha'etz on the seed and a Barei Pri Ha'adama on the outside of the thing, right? If you ate olives don't really have a shell, but almonds. If you ate almond shells, right? I've never heard of somebody doing so, but if you ate almond shells, that would be a Barei Pri Ha'adama because the almond itself is the seed, is the primary fruit on which we make a Barei Pri Ha'etz. Okay. So the fruit of a tree, you say over the secondary part of the bracha, Barei Pri Ha'adama. If there's fruit of the ground, you say over the secondary part, She'akol, right? You downgrade it one step. So the people sometimes eat watermelon rind. That they eat, most people, if you say you don't eat the green part of the watermelon, if you ask which part of the watermelon do you eat, they won't tell you the green part, right? They'll say you eat the red part, or maybe it's a yellow watermelon, right? But you don't eat the watermelon peel. So therefore, if you did eat the watermelon peel, and there are some people that do, or they pickle it or they do something with it, so when you eat it, you say Shehakol because it's not primarily the part of the watermelon that's eaten, on which you'd say Barei Pri Ha'adama, and therefore it's downgraded to a Shehakol. And so therefore, the caper tree was something that was around in Eretz Yisrael, and that they dealt with. We have these little caper berries that you get sometimes as a garnish on a salad or in something capers they're sort of generally very salty. They're very little berries. And these were something that was around. Yes, what was that?
Amazing in tuna salad, by the way.
That's right. I was thinking of that. The Cafe Sababa puts them in the tuna salad. So there's something which grows on the tree and is the fruit, the primary fruit of the tree. But there's other parts, other edible parts of that plant. And so in the Gemara, this is actually one of the hardest sections of that chapter of Gemara, where they go in the whole chapter of what bracha do you say on what food. The caperberry bush is one of the most difficult sugyas, and it's because there's so many different parts that are edible, so they have to figure out which is which bracha to say on which part. Okay, so we say the caper tree whose leaves are edible, and where its leaves are joined with the stem, there's a small edible buds, right? There's like the growth of the juncture of willow leaves. And the caper berries form the main part of the fruit, while the caper flowers are only a peel around the fruit like the shell of a nut, but are also edible. So here you have 4 parts of this plant that are edible, right? You've got the leaves and the little buds, and the berries and the berry pods. They're sort of like a shell, a pod around the berry. And that's technically the flower. Okay. Over the berries, which constitute the fruit itself, you say Bore Priya Eitz. And over the leaves and the little buds and the flowers, you say Bore Priya Adama. They make it seem so equal, so simple here. It's a lot harder in the Gemara. Likewise, over preserves made of rose leaves with honey and sugar, you would say the bracha Bore Priya Adama. Now, rose bush, right? That's a tree. And so if it was the fruit of the rose bush, you would say a Bore Priya Eitz. But this is not really a fruit. People don't generally eat rose flowers. But because they can be prepared in a way that is made into preserves, so then when you do it, you say Bore Priya Adama on the rose flowers, on the flower petals. Although they grow on trees, they are not the fruit, right? So similarly, over preserves made of orange peel, right? Again, we said orange peel is not the main thing. Honey and sugar. He said the bracha Bore Priya Adama, right? Which is strange because it's already you're not eating it raw. But since the people, when they do eat orange peel, normally eat it in preserves. So this is the normal way of eating orange peel. So you would say Bore Priya Adama on the orange peel. Over cucumber peel that was fried with honey and sugar, you'd say the bracha shahakol. Again, people don't usually eat cucumber peels at all. You can eat them with the cucumber, right? But I've never seen somebody eating just the peels of the cucumber on purpose. So we're going to say it. That would be something which you would say shahakol. Over the pods of peas that are cultivated in the fields, even though they taste sweet, yet if you ate them without the peas, you would write the bracha shahakol. Right? There's different kinds of peas, right? We have the snap peas and the snow peas and the string beans and the green peas. So here we're talking not about the kinds of peas that are normally eaten in the pod, right? And snap peas or snow peas, where they're normally eaten in the pod, right? And string beans, green beans, you eat the pod whole. So that would be Bore Priya Adama, including the pod. But on kinds of peas, which are normally extracted, or beans that are extracted from the pods, but the pods are still edible. I think it's sometimes like adamame. You can find that adamame served in the pod. More often than not, people eat the soybeans in the pods and discard the pods. But you could also eat the pods. So if you ate the pods, but you were eating them not with the peas that were in them, right? Not with the beans that are in them, but on their own, so you say a shahakol. If you're eating them with the peas inside, so you say Bore Priya Adama, because it's normally you would eat the peas. So they're the fruit, and the shells are sort of along for the ride. But if you were to sit down and once somebody's been through their adamame and left all the shells, and you're going to come and eat their leftover adamame pods, you would say a shahakol on that and not a Bore Priya Adama. Yes, Kesha.
Just wanted to clarify. Rose goes to Eitz because it's got like a wooded brush to it and regrows.
The rose, the rose bush is a plant which has leaves which endure through the winter. and produce leaves and flowers again the next year. So it's considered a tree. Okay. I think we're going to stop here for tonight. It's 9 o'clock. We'll continue with this next week. I hope this is helpful to people to sort of to understand which bracha to say on what thing. I know sometimes it can feel like it's a little bit nitpicky, right? You're getting very, very detailed oriented. And why does this matter so much that we're going to spend so much time on it? I think it's an important thing to understand which bracha to say on what thing, and this is something that our sages have emphasized, that a person should really put in the effort to know what bracha to say on each food. Giovanna, yeah.
Yes, sorry, I got a question. Like, it's gonna be like next week, like same time, same day?
Yeah, we have this practical halacha class. We have every Sunday evening at 8 o'clock Pacific time.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, my friend.
Rabbi, can you just say, I put you on the spot, but just like in a very brief statement, what does this do for you? How can we remain motivated, to deal with the minutiae of the details?
Very good.
Not that I'm not.
I understand. Yeah. What significance, right? What does it matter? So you said this bracha, you say that bracha. The point, you're not questioning the practice of saying brachot, right? We want to, that sort of speaks for itself, that we want to show the gratitude. I think there's a sense of like this. When we as people are commanded in the Garden of Eden to fill the earth and subdue it, and to be caretakers of the whole earth. One of the ways that we sort of show our dominion is by understanding the right place, and that we're saying the right bracha on something says that I'm effectively elevating this to God. I'm recognizing that God has given me this particular thing, and I'm sort of elevating it and drawing it into holiness. So to recognize it, to say I am master of this fruit, not master more than God, but right, that God has entrusted it to me, and we have we as people have cultivated it and grown. Now, obviously, I think it would be far more meaningful if this was fruit that you've grown in your garden, and the sense of saying Bori Priya Adama or Bori Priya Eitz, when you grew it, makes more sense, right? To be focused on these details. And when we're so far removed from the food production process, right, that we should say Bori Priya supermarket on all of it, right? That in of itself is a problem. And I think that knowing the right bracha and understanding the details actually helps us to reconnect to the natural order of things, right? To reconnect to the fact that this is a plant. And it came from the plant, and to sort of reconnect to the gardener in us that we're often so alienated from, and that when we're eating, we're just gobble, 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 and we're not really thinking about how this was grown, and all of that. So I think knowing the right bracha and spending time thinking about the right bracha when now, but even more so when you're preparing to eat, it really connects you back to the earth and to the sense of how the food was in fact produced, and it's not just food, it's a plant that God gave us, and that we as people have cultivated, and the whole process of production of getting it to our house is many steps involved. So I think that there's value in it from that angle.
Thank you. I knew you'd have a great answer. Thank you. Perfect.
Okay, friends, have a wonderful. It's a new year for us. And it's a new month, the month of Shvat. I wish you all a wonderful, happy and healthy new 2022 and a new Shvat. And we'll see you again here next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You as well. Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye. Thank you.
Okay. Good night.
Bye, Rabbi.